Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the March 23rd, 2023 Committee of the Whole Budget meeting to order. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin homelands. I would like to thank the Algonquin nations for hosting this meeting on their land. I now call for a mover to approve the agenda. Trustee Nash, does anyone have any changes or additions to the agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor? Carried. I would now like to ask if anyone has an interest to declare, to please do so now. Seeing none, we have no delegations this evening. So now I call upon Director Giroux to introduce report 23-044. Over to you, Madam Director.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Tonight, we're pleased to move forward with the next step in our annual budget process. You'll recall that in the first budget meeting of the year, we proposed a deficit budget in the range of $9 to $39 million. With a commitment to continue to look at opportunities to address that number and to reduce both in-year costs and find opportunities for next year. When we came back at academic staffing, we had revised that forecast to between $9 and $24 million, and we found $2.3 million in savings at academic staffing. We finally received the much anticipated GSNs in the last month, and this evening we are going to walk you through the GSNs and what that means in terms of funding. And we're currently looking at a deficit of $19.8 million. And so before I turn it over to Associate Director Gerwa and his team to explain the process to you, just a reminder that this evening is an opportunity for us to better understand the GSNs, our revenues and large-scale expenditures. We have been working with that information and working to prepare a staff recommended budget that will come forward to you next week. And we will bring forward a balanced budget at that time. And we will do that recognizing your requests wherever possible for options or considerations, and to follow the same kinds of principles that we followed in the academic staffing process. But our task tonight is not to be talking about the specific issues in next year's budget, but rather to understand the financing and the revenues and expenses, and a chance for those of you, especially those of you who are new in your roles, to be able to explore those funding models and differentiate between GSN funding and special transfer payment funding, et cetera. And so with that, I will hand it over to Associate Director Gerwa, and he and General Manager Adam Thwaite will explain the process to you.
Through you, Chair. I had a presentation. Is that it up there? Okay, so we're here to talk about the budget development update for 23-24. Next slide. So the key dates, the 17th of April, the Minister released the budget and the memos associated with the budget. Tonight, we're going to give an impact on the technical papers and where we sit. 31st of May, we will present a staff recommended budget, and then over the course of the next month, we'll go back and forth, and then on the 3rd of June, we are obligated to approve a board budget. Next slide. So just the landscape, Ontario budget did not add significant funding to school boards. I think it's important to note that in some ways it was actually a reduction in school board allocations. We predicted a pressure between $9 and $39 million before we received the technical papers, and it was approximately $23.4 million when all was said and done. And when I say pressure, that wasn't necessarily reductions in revenues, but we started with a $9.1 million deficit that we had to deal with. So we were looking at $23.4 million deficit based on the technical papers. And then OCDSB OCDSB is committed to finding savings that minimally impacts students and staff. I think that's been the direction from the board and the direction from the senior team. We also committed to aligning to the decisions within the board's strategic plan. So that's how we started the budgeting process. Next slide. So these are the key GSN changes from the ministry. Funding for principals, vice principals, office administrators. So they basically gave us new funding for virtual schools. The interesting part about that funding change was that it took a little bit of funding away in other areas that we receive funding for students. So although it was a little bit of a win and for the Ps and VPs, some of the bricks and mortars type revenues that we receive for virtual students was removed. We received some new funding for safe and clean schools. There was a realignment of the Indigenous funding envelope and a one-time funding realignment for us. So a removal of $5.6 million and a one-time bridge realignment of $1.2 million for that loss. They also made an interim special incidents funding approach. So they changed the way they're funding the SIP. There's a new funding formula for student transportation, but they also acknowledge that it's going to take 4 years to implement that new funding model, and that the new funding model is going to require some tweaks through that process. So what we see as a funding model today might not be what we see as a funding model 4 years from now, but that new funding model left us a gap in funding of approximately $13.8 million. So we will have to work with the ministry. We're already working with OSTA and the Ottawa Catholic School Board on challenging some of the fundamental principles that they use to generate that formula. So we're hoping that we can close that gap, but it may require a significant review of the way we provide transportation within the school board over the next couple of years, which would probably align with the program review that we committed to do in the strategic review or the strategic plan anyway. So I'm just putting that out there. The ministry did remove the $10 million in COVID funding, which we had heard prior to the technical papers dropping would probably be the case, and that did happen. There was a provision for labor expenses in the for the central collective bargaining process. So although it looked like we received new funding, it was earmarked specifically for that and cannot be used for anything else. So although they say the number increased by X, approximately $14 million of that was not available for us to use within the board. Then there is the continuation of this support for students, which was a positive because that hasn't been finished in the negotiations and the collective agreements. There was also a couple of PPFs that rolled into the GSN. There's 3 of them there, not significantly large amounts, but it's nice to see them roll into the GSN. Next slide. So some other considerations that we're going through is there was some projected student growth of 2,588 students on the ADE, so that's a positive effect on our revenues. As I mentioned earlier, there's a $13.8 million transitionary piece with the transportation envelope. So they haven't committed to how they're going to phase that out over the next 4 years. There was some discussion at COSBO, and the COSBO exec also had some discussions behind the scenes that said that they wouldn't pull it out until after the 4 years, but there is some issues with growth and they could change their mind as well. So it's important to note that that transitionary amount is there and it will change and it could reduce at any time. They also provided us again some funding for obligatory pressures. Like I said, the central agreement, the $14 million for potential raises, but also CPP and EI. And there's also some inflationary pressures in our budget that we have to consider, the utilities and things like that. So some of those are known, but this isn't new funding, but these are just considerations when we're building our recommended staff budget. And then portable moves was another large significant expense because we have so many new students, but not new buildings. It requires more portables, which you guys approved earlier in the year, and we will be placing them. Next slide. So this is the revenues, the opening balance of where we started the fiscal year, and then some of the changes that you can see, the ins and the outs. I'm not going to go over each line item, but that's where we started with the revenues. The next one is the expenses. So you can see some of the changes in there. And the important number on this slide is the last line, which is the deficit, which is where we started the staff recommended budget from to generate a balanced budget. Next slide. These are some of the new PPF, or sorry, these are the existing PPFs and how they've changed. So the majority of the PPFs are continuing, and there's small adjustments up and down between them, but net, it looks like there's just a small decrease of about $100,000 between all those PPFs. So that's a positive. Next slide. These are some of the new PPFs that we received, and it looks like it cut off a little bit of the slide there, but in your package, you'll see the two large ones that we were expecting was the reading enhancements and the reading intervention and math intervention. So those were significant. Then there's the next three are the three that I mentioned that rolled over into the GSN. And then there are still quite a few that were outstanding, although unfortunately for us, the second one there is now, we've gotten indications that tutoring supports will not continue. So that's a fairly large PPF, but there's still some technical paper or clarifications that we're waiting for on the remaining PPFs. Next slide. And the starting point after the GSN data, as I mentioned, we started the staff recommended budget with a $19.8 million deficit after the academic staffing was approved. We continue to prioritize student staff and those things that were identified in the strategic plan. And we are leveraging envelope funding, MTCA, supply accounts, and revenues as kind of the key activities to close the gap on that deficit. And next slide. And the first meeting to actually discuss the staff recommended budget is next week on the 31st of May. And then the future dates to continue on with those discussions until we have a board recommended approved budget. And next slide. I will open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Associate Director. And I do have a speakers list or questioner list, and I'll start with Trustee Kaplan-Murth, please.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I have a couple of quick questions. One is looking at the new funding initiatives. Maybe this is more of a statement than a question, but I just wanted to point out, because the public has asked about why we aren't canceling initiatives for virtual schools, but funding for initiatives for virtual schools falls under that new funding, which is so important for students for so many reasons from an accessibility and equity lens. So is it fair to say that that does not in any way take away from our, that's not an imposition on us as a school board or as a district? We're getting that funding from the Ministry of Education for virtual schools?
We are getting funding, and the Associate Director can explain. We had made the funding announcement was late relative to need. We had made the decision to proceed with the virtual school program for next year in advance of the funding direction. There is now funding, but it's not being funded at the same level as funding for regular day school. And the superintendent, or sorry, the Associate Director can speak to what that delta in funding looks like.
Through you, Chair. I don't have the exact number in front of me, and I don't know if you do, Terry, or not. 300 grand? What's it? Anyway, I can tell you that we are operating that program at a loss compared to so we're receiving less funding than we're putting out on virtual school.
Okay.
Through you, Chair. We are losing about approximately $400,000. The cost exceeds it by about $400,000 in funding.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My next question also about the new funding initiatives is the funding for safe and clean schools. Is that funding that can be used to look at improving air quality in classrooms and ventilation, HEPA filters, and so on?
Associate Director.
Through you, Chair. So there was some continued funding to continue to support HEPA filters and those sort of things, but we probably could talk more about that in the staff recommended budget. I don't want to specifically say that we're doing more with that funding. Many of the small pots of funding that we receive, whether it's a PPF or a new funding initiative, we use those pots of funding to offset part of the $23.4 million pressure so that we didn't have to further reduce portions of the budget that impacted students and staff, right? So it's a bit of a balancing game.
Thank
Okay.
you. Trustee.
Next question, in terms of mental health supports, I saw in the budget there was summer funding for mental health. Is there any additional funding for youth mental health coming from the Ministry of Education?
Madam Director.
I'll start, and the Associate Director and the Superintendent of Learning Support Services may want to add in. I would say an accurate description is the majority of funding in the budget for mental health is not to school districts directly, but to School Mental Health Ontario. And I don't know if the superintendent wants to add to that.
Superintendent Simmons.
Madam Chair, through you, what I've heard anecdotally from my contacts at the ministry is not to expect additional funding for mental health supports apart from what's already been announced.
Thank you, Superintendent. Trustee.
So for School Mental Health Ontario, is there a way that we advocate to them or collaborate with them or?
So we do work with School Mental Health Ontario, and the superintendent can speak more clearly to it. There's a balance in mental health services between what is our role in service provision and what is community support. And I think what the superintendent can speak to is there is a need for more collaboration in the community so that it's clearer for families where and how they access support. And hopefully some of that might come clearer with the funding to School Mental Health Ontario. Superintendent, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I would add is that we work with School Mental Health Ontario daily. Our mental health lead, Emily Balla, is in regular communication, and we meet monthly with them, at which time we have our opportunities to express or to advocate for needs within the district. But also recognizing that we function within a continuum of care with our community service providers. So.
Okay, thank you. And one last question in terms of special education supports, have they substantially decreased in our current budget? Thank you.
I don't think that's the description we'd use. Either of you. I don't see anything. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's no direct cut to current levels of service that we've been providing. There is going to be a recommendation in the budget, which we'll wait. I'm not going to talk too much about that until we finish the staff recommended budget, but you will see an option there in that space.
Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Trustee Kaplan-Murphy. Over to Trustee Presley, please.
Thank you, Chair, through you. AD Gerois. Okay. Do you have any indication of why the tutoring supports of just over $4 million is not being renewed?
Madam Director.
It was introduced as a post-COVID program. Definitely there were some opportunities with the tutoring funding, some that we were able to allocate centrally, some that had to be delivered in terms of direct service. There was a lot of layered on work associated with the delivery of the tutoring program. And so not surprising that the tutoring program ended because it was a post-COVID initiative. I think ideally We would have liked to have seen some of that funding come into the regular classroom stream, but it was intended as sort of booster support.
Excellent. Thank you, Director. A few more questions, Chair, if I may. For the PPFs that aren't confirmed or possibly ending, do we have any indication of when we might have notice of that, or any further context regarding that?
Through you, Chair. So they've even said themselves on several meetings I've been on with the ministry that it will happen even as late as throughout the latter part of the summer. So we've been reaching out to different parts of the ministry to try to get clarification, even if they don't have the actual technical paper written or firm direction written. But they're actually literally having meetings. I attended a meeting, I think it was a Friday, on the Indigenous funding, talking about the parameters of the changes that they did with that particular funding envelope. So they're working through that now.
I see. Thank you. And thank you, Chair, through you. I will say on a personal opinion, I'm going to find that very hard for us to finalize a budget when we don't have all the information available to us, which is going to be something to navigate. In regards to, and through you, Chair, in regards to our transportation, I understand the model's changing. Do we know what the distance model will be and how it might impact our ability to offer transportation to students, or is that something that we're still going to be working through?
So our distances match the distances the ministry uses in their generating their funding formula. But I think the change that they're looking at is, or at least some of the early areas that we can see are the small buses, transportation. That portion seems to be underfunded for what we spend per small bus, and maybe ones that aren't full. Right. So single student transportation.
Thank you very much. Oh, I guess that's the end of my questions for now. Thank you, Chair. If I may, if I have time left, perfect. Would someone be able to provide a little bit more information on the ASD-AQ subsidy in our PPF funding that's gone from 77,000 down to 26,000? Maybe just a little bit for me to understand that a bit better.
Madam Director?
Just to make sure that I heard you properly, did you ask about the ASD AQ subsidy?
Yeah, the ASD. Yeah, just if you give me a little bit more background information on that if possible.
So that's a PPF that is continuing, and Superintendent Simmons can speak to that.
Madam Chair, through you, that amount is actually 26,000. The 76,000 was money that we were committed over 3 years. So I've been speaking with the manager about correcting that piece. It is an amount of money that allows us to compensate teachers for taking additional qualifications courses in the area of special education. And that one is in ASD in particular, communication disorders.
Thank you, Chair. That's all my questions for now.
Thank you, Trustee Presley. Over to Trustee Scott, please.
Thank you. Just following up, more questions about the nature of the grants, and if there can't be answered tonight, that's fine. I'm happy to have them included in the written answers. But in terms of the changes to transportation funding, even if the distances are the same and they may be looking differently at students with special education needs, which could impact our ability to transport students to specialized classes, are they also looking at transportation basically from home to the closest one of our schools with the appropriate grades?
That is a possibility. Through OSTA, we're working with the ministry to better understand. I have a meeting later this week with the general manager of OSTA to talk about some of the preliminary issues. And OSTA was already planning a service review. And so that service review will now start to align with the ministry funding direction, right? And so we'll have to better understand what that looks like. I don't think we'll have that for budget so much as over the course of the next year.
Thank you. I appreciate if information on that could continue to be provided to trustees as we get anything firm out of the ministry. Because certainly reading the technical paper for the grants, it is well obscured as to exactly what is intended. Second question relates to the grants for Indigenous education and the change there, which is a very significant reduction. Could somebody please explain just how that change actually works?
Madam Director?
Do you want to use? Go ahead.
So we received a reduced amount of the grant than we've received in previous years, but they haven't defined all the priorities on how they want that grant being spent. That was the meeting they attended last week with the ministry, and they provided a PowerPoint slide with a bunch of suggestions of the things that they wanted to prioritize while they were working through the community. They're going to send that slide out to the directors, and then we're going to consult with the community and the board and provide them some further feedback. But they're in the process of defining the priorities and restrictions for that grant right now. Does that answer your question?
It might be helpful if Associate Director Reynolds explains how we have been using the Indigenous funding, just that funding structure itself, because I think several trustees don't understand how that funding was applied here and then the impetus for the shift.
So
I think that the big piece of my question relates to the fact that a chunk of the funding comes because we offer now a larger number of students a course in Indigenous studies. And if it means that we can't spend the funding to provide that course, but have to turn everything into the Indigenous Education Action Plan, the Board Action Plan for Indigenous Education, that marks a change of direction. And I guess that's what I was hoping to understand, is how it is going to be different from what we are doing now.
Exactly. And so that's the question I think Associate Director Reynolds can explain. And we'll still be able to offer the grade 11 Indigenous focused English programming, but we won't receive the same kind of funding for it. But the Associate Director can explain how we've been using that funding, and then we'll talk about what's different.
Sure, thank you. And through you, Chair, and Associate Director Gerald can correct me if I'm a little bit wrong on where the money's going. But the ministry offers a per pupil amount for anyone registered in an Indigenous Studies course. And I believe it's a little over $1,100, maybe close to $1,200 per pupil per credit. The ministry has since clarified their expectations on that, and that it was really intended as seed money where you had small classes so that the district could afford to provide them. So now that we're running a number of sections of Indigenous education courses, like our grade 11 English, and they are running at full size, basically, the ministry has clarified that we wouldn't really qualify for that funding anymore, and that it was never the intention that we would receive that funding. We're not looking at a clawback or anything like that, not to worry about it. So it does mean that it does change how we will pay for the staffing in those MBE, those are the grade 11 English classes, a little bit, but we'll be able to continue offering them. And I don't think it's expected to have any impact on the services we provide directly to Indigenous students through our programs that are typically run through that team and Superintendent Smith. So Associate Director Giroir, please correct me, but there's a reduction, but I don't think it's going to actually have any negative impact on services or course offerings provided.
Through your chair, I'll just add to that. Yeah, we'll still receive funding to top up course anywhere where the student enrollment is between 8 and less than 23. There's still a little funding formula to compensate the board for running those courses if they're under 23, and it's a sliding scale. And so they clarified that piece, and then really the net result of the changes is there'll be a much larger pot of Indigenous funding for Indigenous type requirements or needs within school boards.
And since I think I have time for one more question, and that is relating to the changes in the special incidents portion for the special education grants and how that affects us, because I know they were using sort of a proxy number before in calculating that amount. And I wonder if I could have a of what exactly is changing and how the number is being determined now.
Superintendent Simmons.
Through you, Chair. So the ministry is undertaking a review of the special incidents portion this current year. So what they've done this year, or what they're going to do, is reduce the administrative load on school districts to prepare individual summaries for all the submission, as we typically do every other year. What we understand now is that they're going to apply a percentage increase to our baseline amount. But we won't know that. Typically, we don't get a response on an annual SIP amount until after the holidays within the school year. So I'm not sure when we will get an indication of when that total amount will be, but indications are so far that it should not be a reduction. It should be a baseline plus a percentage increase.
Thank you. That's all my questions for now.
Thank you, Trustee Scott. Trustee Dixon, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I have two questions. Everybody else has basically covered the questions that I wanted to ask, but the one that I'm really concerned about is the anti-sex trafficking. We really have a lot of problems with that within our schools right now. So I'm not understanding why we'd be cutting back, possibly ending that. And then I guess a little bit with the tutoring and supporting. I mean, we have a lot of kids, and especially now that we've changed with the grade 9 mathematics and stuff. So why would we end it when we still have kids that are struggling?
Madam Director.
Thank you. So through you, Madam Chair, to clarify, these are targeted funding that come from the ministry to us that the ministry is discontinuing. So the ministry has made the decision not to have targeted funding in a particular area. And so the question for us in some of these things, not all of them, because we can't continue all of them, but is where are we at in our work, and how can we continue, or how can we undertake some of that work if that work is something we prioritize within our existing resources, or how will we navigate that? So that's the piece that we're working at. In terms of the tutoring and the math piece, I should clarify that the tutoring program, as it was created, that funding has changed. There is new targeted funding for math, to support math. And we know that there will be significant direction coming from the ministry on that. And we'll have more information on that as we move forward over the next few months. And so we can anticipate that there may be some targeted supports there. And that gets to the issue of PPF funding in general, because I think there was an earlier question around how can we develop a budget if we don't actually have all of the PPF information. And the reality is, and PPF grants historically, and increasingly more so, that they are very specific in terms of how we can use the funding and the timeline for the funding. And so often there is no board approval in relation to PPF funding, because there are small amounts, or they're targeted amounts, or they tell us exactly what we have to do. So the challenge for us in a budget year like this one is to make sure that we are not offering something out of the grants for student needs that is subsequently going to be funded through a PPF grant that we don't yet understand. So that's one of the things that we're watching for.
Is that all, Trustee Dixon?
That's it. Thank you.
All right. Trustee Evans?
Thank you. So I guess my first question is, can we go back to the Indigenous funding? I'd like to sort of interrogate a little bit, or figure out why we have lost that funding. Has the ministry decided that they don't want to fund our model versus other models? Or have they decided to lower Indigenous funding across the province? I could get a little bit more clarification on that.
Madam Director?
I think what the ministry message is that Indigenous funding is intended to support the specific needs of Indigenous students. And so they have done a couple of things. They have revisited what they use as a base definition for Indigenous students. They were using self-identification data from school districts, and they decided that data was inconsistent across the province. So they're using a combination of, I believe it's average daily enrollment and StatsCan data. Don't quote me on that, but that's what I think it is. So that piece has changed, but also, as the Associate Director explained, we were offering or we were receiving funding because of the breadth of offerings in the grade 11 Indigenous English course. That money was coming back to the district and it was being applied to all revenues. What they're saying is, first of all, it's intended, as the Associate Director explained, to be seed funding. So it's intended to help you grow programs, not to offer a core course. And when you generate revenue from that, that revenue should be spent exclusively to support the Indigenous community or the extension of Indigenous knowledge in some way. And so it's a tighter enveloping, if you will, of that funding and a little bit more control with that one-time transfer payment to offset the reduction that some districts would experience. Because like us, we were an early adapter of the grade 11 in Indigenous English course offering. And so we have been benefiting from that for a while, but that started to be replicated across districts. And so there was a huge cost without the money being invested in to Indigenous education.
Sounds to me like we are being punished for our success. Okay, my next question was about note 1 and 2. So in Appendix C, you have note 1, Vice Principal, or Principal, Vice Principal, note 1, MISC changes, note 2, and then no footnotes. And I'm wondering what those footnotes were intended to say.
Associate Director.
That was in Appendix C.
Appendix C, Report 23004 or 044.
Through you, Chair. Those are typos. We'll have to remove them.
Thank you, Manager.
Okay. My next question was about the virtual school. So we offer virtual school with a full principal at both the elementary and the secondary level. We offer a number of supports at both the elementary and the secondary level. Are there requirements at the provincial level for us to have a full principal, a full vice principal, and administrative supports for both the secondary and the elementary or virtual schools? Or are some of those positions discretionary?
Madam Director.
So I'm not sure that it's the provincial model that establishes discretion or not. The new provincial model is funding positions, and the Associate Director can speak to what it's funding. What we will need to do now that we have focused funding for virtual learning is make some decisions about what the long-term delivery model is and what the staffing model is. But if I'm not mistaken, the staffing model for OCV was included as part of academic staffing already. So, so we dealt with that in the earlier meetings, and I'll turn to the Associate Director to clarify what that delta in funding is.
Through you, Chair. It's on page 3 of the report. You'll see under school funding remote learning, the delta is $438,000. It's the new funding formula is based on ADE. And then we put those amounts in there based on what we currently are staffing and removed. And so it just shows, I can't speak on the portion of what the formula allocates or how the staff is, the principals or VPs are allocated. I'm not sure if that's, I don't know, Terry, if you know.
Sorry, through you, Chair. I think the question is how much are we funded versus how much is being expensed?
The question, I think people have missed the point. The question was, are these positions discretionary, and could we choose to merge the principal for the elementary and the secondary level, or could we merge the vice principal for the elementary and the secondary level to try and save those costs, given that there is such a significant delta between the amount that we are funded and the amount that we are spending?
So there are a couple of issues. I don't think that we could answer that this evening. There's definitely something that we could take a look at and speak to next week when we bring back the staff recommended budget. We'll want to look at what the enrollment projection is and also the distribution of work. There are some differences in roles and responsibilities, elementary and secondary. So that's something we can take a look at and provide some clarity on next week.
Okay. The other thing that I would think useful that you have mentioned you will bring back is the cost per pupil. So we are losing $140,000, $448,000 on virtual school. Are there 10 kids in the program? Are there 1,000 kids in the program? And understanding the cost per pupil, I think, would be helpful. So if you could bring that back with that information.
So just to clarify, we can definitely come back with enrollment. And we can talk about the per pupil cost of funding, and we can do an analysis of where our costs differ from the funding model. But the per pupil cost in terms of funding, we'll have to look at it more carefully, will be different in part because the infrastructure is different, some of those pieces. But we'll do some analysis and bring that back next week.
All right, thanks. I had another question, but I think it's from 5.2, so we can come back to that later. Thanks.
Over to Trustee Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair. I know a number of trustees have already asked about the tutoring support, so forgive me if you've already answered this. There's lots of information to digest. So they're ending tutoring supports, and yet they're getting new funding for the reading intervention. You did mention, Director, that there's new funding for math, but I'm not sure if you could just provide a little more clarity. What exactly then is that we're losing in the tutoring supports, yet we're gaining new funding for math and reading?
Madam Director.
So we can't answer with certainty because we don't know all of the pieces, but the funding for reading intervention is classroom-based funding. So that will cover in large part the cost of classroom screening tools. Part of the new ministry requirement will be regular screening of students in kindergarten and grade 1. And so there will be a cost for the tool that's used for screening and the reporting on that. I don't know how much of that off the top of my head relates to the cost of administering the screening and supporting that. That's to be determined. And on math, we don't have all of the details yet on math and how that will work. And I think the Associate Director explained what we're seeing, particularly this week. I think today I received 3 separate invitations to meetings this week on consultations with directors and superintendents on Indigenous education, on OCT qualification. So on a number of the pieces that were either in the GSNs or that are in the new legislation. There's a lot of activity happening to try and define those. And so we will start to see more clarity either through PPM or in some cases through regulation.
Thank you. And so we're also losing then the free menstrual products in Ontario schools, and that's definitely an equity question. Is there an opportunity for us to partner with any other, jurisdictions federally? I know they offer public servants the opportunity to have those products.
So this district was ahead of the ministry initiative on menstrual products. So we have a budget allocation for that. And I'm not entirely certain about the reduction in the PPF, and I don't know if the Associate Director will know, but some of that may be for the initial startup cost or maybe a change there, because I believe that the ministry is still providing products. Is that correct? Yes. So there still is a provision of products to us, but that may have been some startup. But we did have and we continue to have some budget allocation for that.
Thank you, trustee Jenkins. Over to trustee Presley for second time speakers. All right. Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question about Appendix A, the first part of the table, where it says Indigenous education allocation under program. The next line is less deferred revenue. And then the following line is one-time realignment mitigation fund. Is that with regard to the Indigenous education allocation, or is that with regard to something else?
Through you, Chair, that is the or the envelope funding that we received from the Indigenous grant. If we don't spend all the grant in any one year, it does defer and roll over to the following year. So we have not utilized all the grant in any one year, and so that's why there's a small balance. And the $1.2 million is the bridge funding that we're receiving to kind of move away from the way most boards in the province have been using the funding.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to be clear on whether or not that realignment was tied to the change in the Indigenous or whether it was tied to something else. And I did have one other question as well, if I can just remember. Oh, I remember what it was. And that is with regard to the changes in the transportation funding model and the transportation allocation. Since I believe OC Transpo has decided that they are going to provide free transit, free public transit for children under 12 now, is that going to have any impact, do you think, on OSTA's operations or not? Because I don't think very many younger students are using public transit anyway.
Through you, Chair. We did sit with OSTA and go line by line through their budget, and because we were aware that policy existed, but it still hasn't been confirmed in their new budget. We did factor in an efficiency savings to their budget based on that policy change. It won't impact what we receive from the ministry, but it did impact the deficit that we're facing with OSTA and the pressure that it's putting on our GSN.
Thank you.
Trustee Evans.
Thank you. I have a couple more quick questions. I noticed the restraint savings allocation, and that's not a line item I'm familiar with.
Madam Director.
Sorry, I did not hear the
Restraints savings allocation.
Do you have a reference?
Appendix A. First page, about 10 lines down.
Through you, Chair. It's a small cost savings initiative by the ministry. I don't have the exact details, but I can certainly look that up and give you more details if you'd like.
Thank you, Manager.
I would, thank you. My other question was about the EDP program. So it's listed here under revenues, and I understand it's supposed to be cost revenue neutral. And so I'm wondering if we are bringing in about $2 million on that, or if it should be, I'm just sort of wondering about that as well.
I assume that it shows as both a revenue and expense. So the revenue piece comes in as part of our revenue, and the expense should net out approximately the same.
Through you, Chair, we expect it to be cost neutral or possibly a small surplus.
And now I'm going to ask about the infant day program. And are we still using the revenues from the extended day program to offset the infant program?
I think Associate Director Reynolds can probably best speak to that.
Thanks, through you, Chair. At this time, we're no longer offering an infant program. It's just a toddler preschool program. And it's my understanding that it is now operating without being offset by funds from the EDP program.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, Trustee Kaplan-Murphy.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Question about staff replacement costs. So I see that the working budget's allotting an increase to the occasional teacher budget up to 32 million. I'm just wondering, given my understanding, and I could be incorrect, is that that was a huge cost for us in the last year or so because of staff illness and burnout. So would that amount, the increase of up to 32 million, would that cover our costs, do we think? Or are we still going to be in deficit because of so many absences?
Director Giroux.
So our replacement worker cost has been growing over a number of years. And we continue to see that. We will have more explanation about how we're positioning that in the budget next week when we do our presentation. Excuse me. I think what I would say at this point is, from a budget perspective, we're looking to move that number closer to the actual because there's been a big delta there. But we're also looking at what are some examples where we might have investments that help to reduce the cost. So when we bring the budget back next week, you'll see an adjustment to the budget amount, but you'll also see some other areas of investment that we hope help to mitigate some of those things as well.
Thank you, Trustee Kaplan-Murphy. And I have nobody left on my speakers list. So if it's okay with the committee, I'd like to move on to the next item. All right, I now call upon Director Giroux to introduce report 23-034. Over to you, Madam Director.
So this is our revised estimates for the current year, our updated financial forecast based on revised estimates, and I will invite the Associate Director to walk through the report.
Through you, Chair. So the deficit that we were projecting at revised estimates was $9.1 million. That has not changed. But what has changed is that we've implemented a bunch of cost-saving measures to monitor the financial situation of the board, i.e. we did a few, not staff freezes, but just pauses. And then we've also made some investments and provided some clarity on use of leave and staff replacement costs. We actually saw those costs improving over the course of a few months, but they have started to grow again as we approach the end of the school year. So as it stands right now, we were not able to definitively say that our forecasted financial position will change significantly from what the $9.1 million, but we are hopeful that that the position will most likely be in a better position than what we originally had forecasted at revised estimates based on some of the cost measures that we put in place.
Thank you, Associate Director. I am looking around the table. I see no hands. I see a hand. Trustee Evans.
I just wanted to say thank you. This report is very clear, and I know you put a lot of work into it. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Trustee Evans. And I think that is well said. Oh,
I just want to make a comment. I want to thank the team. I think that the majority of the work that went into the two reports that you see tonight came from the finance team. They've been working nonstop since the GSN has been released. And when I say nonstop, I mean evenings and weekends to get us to the stage we're at today. There's not a lot of time between when those technical papers drop and then when they update EFIS, and then how we have to digest that information and produce these reports on top of all the work that the senior staff around here has done. Because when you're in a deficit situation, it's everybody pulling together to look for the efficiencies that help balance the budget, but protect the students and the staff and kind of maintain the priorities that the board set for us. So I don't want to take any credit for the work that the group around this table and in this room and on my team did. That's where all the heavy lifting happened.
Thank you. And, Matt.
I echo the associate director's comments, but also want to just remind everybody that we have a brand new finance team, a new associate director, a new manager, and several positions beneath them. And so we're very fortunate that this team has come together so quickly and worked so hard. So thanks to them.
So I'd like to thank Trustee Evans for her remarks, and I think the fact that there aren't extensive questions speaks to the fact that how well the report is written. And I'd like to thank you for recognizing your team, and of course I'd like to thank you also, Madam Director, for your words. And I'm just looking at manager. All right. So I would like to note that our next meeting will be taking place on the 31st of May, 2023. And I now declare this meeting adjourned.